Welcome back to the Meta Podcast, the integral stage series where we interview interviewers, broadcast broadcasters, and start conversations with conversation starters. We're talking with folks who try to bring forward integrative meta-level, higher, deeper, or transformative perspectives through podcasts, YouTubery, or other online platforms. Who are they? What might they have in common? And how can we amplify, clarify, and interlink them? That's the project, and helping me think, feel, and sense through it today is Damiano Ramazzotti. Or is it Damiano?
the Super Mario accent works. Damiano. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, great to be here. Why don't you give us a sense of what the project is that you've been working on? You mentioned the other day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Ryan Nakade, you may know him, had a great idea for naming what I'm trying to do. And he called it a PerspectivePedia. So this is sort of what I'm trying to do. So on one hand, I'm trying to engage in weird, impossible conversations with people that have either outlandish beliefs or beliefs that I simply don't share or don't understand. And trying to understand what are the mechanics of dialogue that could get us both to learn as much as possible about each other and possibly grow in our perspective. And that's one thing. And possibly make that a format that anybody else could easily reproduce in having other impossible conversations. Whereas the other thing is, how do we record this in a way that I can say, present your perspective about a matter that I don't agree with, in a way that the other people who don't agree with can at least fully understand where you're coming from, why you believe that, and in a way that you feel like you haven't been misrepresented. And so this is the basic premise of what I'm trying to do. I'm still a little bit unsure about how to really bring it as a format. So I enjoy this opportunity because perhaps maybe I find other people who want to join in, who might be interested in it, or who have some advice as to how to do this.
So what have you done so far on the project?
So far, some of the main areas that I've touched is, the first one is I have a colleague. I was lucky it happens to be nearby, who's a really, really devout Catholic. I'm from Italy. He belongs to a very conservative community. So we've tried to do this process and this conversation on a variety of topics, including the big A, abortion. So that one was a really interesting one. And obviously, the more sensitive the subject is, the more I will wait before I put it out, because I need to find the best way to do this. So the second one is anti-vax people. So I've had a conversation with a person who is completely against, or fairly against, vaccines. Anti-maskers is the upcoming one. But I would say, obviously, the most exciting and the most interesting one that I've done so far was with a flat earther. So, and that was, I think, the best place to start with, because it's a crazy idea for most people, but it is also something that is fairly removed from what really makes us angry or frustrated as many of the other topics. So it was a good starting point.
Nobody's getting shot over the flat earth thing.
Exactly.
Well, where did you get to in that flat earth conversation? I mean, what were you able to agree with and understand in terms of the perspective of that person?
So we had two conversations. One was mainly me sort of doing a download of his perspective. And the second one was the one in which I was sort of bringing both challenge points and common ground points. So I'll start with the first part. The first part was, it had a lot of sort of light bulb moments, because there were some aspects of their view that I just simply didn't know. One is the fact that most of them are devout religious believers. So it ties into the whole literal reading of scriptures. The second one was understanding this idea that and this is more about people who have a conspiracy mind. When you have a conspiratorial mind, it's not just one conspiracy or another conspiracy. They don't happen in a vacuum. You begin to see a web of interconnected things, and you see everywhere incentives for manipulation to happen. And therefore, your bias with every new conspiracy that you accept is every time more and more to accepting new ones. So your logical flow is there an incentive to manipulate this idea, yes. Is there a slight proof that that may be the case? Then I'm betting that that's the case. So for someone who is a devout Catholic, a devout Christian, the biggest conspiracy would be to get people away from God. And so what better way to get people away from God than to prove something so outlandishly contrary to Scripture that Earth is round? And now that is not sort of the linear step that most people would do, but there are two other elements that you add, and then they complete the picture. One is this idea that, yes, there are thousands of scientists that believe something, but we all individually have a belief that is completely against the mainstream. I'm sure you do about something. And when it comes to that belief, you think, yes, there's a lot of people who believe that, but something went wrong. Perhaps there was groupthink or conservatism or fear to say something, out of the ordinary. And so this is something that actually we can all empathize with. And the last one, which was the most surprising, is this idea of a science that needs to be based on sensory perception. Because abstraction, anything I can't understand, in a context where there is manipulation, is something that is there to trick me. So it is itself something that I am allergic from and I am doubtful of, and therefore I will always have a bias for things that are in line with my own beliefs, with my own senses. So ultimately these four things, I call it the tree of conspiracy, literal reading of the Bible, groupthink in science, and sensory-based science making. And sort of once you put all these things together, you are inevitably a flat earther. Almost. It's like, obviously I'm exaggerating a little bit, but if you really sort of set your software with these key premises, it is likely that you may end up to these conclusions. And people in the flat earth community are incredibly rational. Paradoxically, they are, some of the reasonings that they have are incredibly elaborate. And so you cannot say of these people that they don't like to think, they don't like to analyze and look things through. So, and that's another element of surprise. These are incredibly inquisitive people and who simply don't trust the scientific structure and have a bias towards certain beliefs.
That's a whole bunch of interesting things altogether. Right? For part of it, what I hear in that is, like, as a species, our collective intelligence is stronger if people hold some anomalous views, because you never know what might turn out to be wrong.
Absolutely.
So overall, we're in a better position, provided that people with anomalous views aren't causing damage and can somehow have coherent communication with people who have other views. Another part of it seems to be what integral theory or general developmental studies would think of as the blue, amber, traditionalist, concrete operational worldview, which seems to, it instinctively feels the world has about a certain size and about a certain duration, right? That it feels right for it to be a few thousand years old and it to be kind of flat, and for it to be organized around a super meaning that we refer to as God. And it does make sense if you say, well, we want to take away some of the elements of your world space and replace them, that you're fundamentally undoing the capacity to get meaning from integrating all the pieces of that world space.
Yeah.
And then the third thing that came up while you were saying that is, there might be something inadequate about our contemporary education system.
Absolutely.
People who really want to think went through our modern schools and they didn't really get an understanding of the modern world. They maybe were told to believe in the modern world, but when they checked with themselves, they didn't have any real experience or ideas that justified that. So in a sense, modern education failed them.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's one of the things we agreed about. We go to the common ground part is like, if I asked you to prove me, why Earth is round, you probably wouldn't be able to come off the top of your head with an experiment to prove that. And the problem is that in school, there are so many things we could actually be taught through experimentation, but what we're actually taught is this is the truth. This is the established truth. And there is something that over time can become pathological, either because you begin to just follow the traditionally established truths, or because then you begin to reject them altogether. And that was one element where we both agreed. I'm sure, like, if he was to send his children to a school where they do experiments, he would be happier, and you would be happier. So that's one first instance of common ground. And to speak to your previous point about religion, the one key element that I smelled in the conversation is that in America, the debate on religion versus science is way stronger than anywhere else. In Italy, some of the most prominent evolutionary scientists are bishops. Whereas, because there is this tradition of more fundamentalist Christianity in America, you have people who, to some extent, are traumatized by this and who emancipate through science. So proving that evolution is right means to prove that God is wrong. And this is really dangerous, because then it pushes people who have found something positive in God, who don't feel traumatized, who don't feel a need to go away, they feel threatened by these other things. So the idea of proposing a spirituality that can include both, whether you agree on it or not, is a better narrative. It's a better conversation that helps both of us grow. And this polarization, I think, is very, very unhealthy. And we see it in the integral community as well.
Yeah, it seems like there's a lot of, that you are available to a lot of critiques of modernity, both in terms of thinking about what progressive changes might need to go on in society in order to overcome limitations of modernity, but also in terms of trying to be empathic and open to people coming at it from what we call pre-modern perspectives.
Yeah, there is this, I think that we have, it's the very banal, simple issue of the mean green meme, meaning that you are tolerant for everybody except for the intolerance, or the ones that you consider belonging to that part. And it reminds me a little bit of when a child learns rules. He's been taught by a loving parent that you shouldn't squish bugs because, you wouldn't want to be squished by a giant. So the child learns that. But then when he sees other children doing that, he doesn't tell them, would you feel bad if someone squished you? He starts yelling at them, you're a bad child, you're not behaving. And a lot of the progressive thinking right now is exactly that. It's just not thinking that there is a reason why you have actually developed a certain level of consciousness. They don't see consciousness, tolerance as a privilege. They see it as a merit. And this is a great disservice to their own integrity and intelligence. And it's a paradox, because the left, which generally embodies these beliefs, is externalist. It believes that everything is caused by your environment. And yet it does not realize that your internal perspectives and your beliefs and your allergies are caused by your environment. So I think we need this is beginning to be the time where we need to have compassion for the uncompassionate, and compassionate for the racist, compassionate for who we think are ignorant. And I'm not the best example of this. I also yell at people online. So this is more of a therapy for me and a tool, rather than just an expression of me being at some higher integral stage.
It seems like a lot of this involves depth versus superficiality in how we hold our experience of the world. That modernity and post-modernity, to some degree, get stuck in very trivial, superficial versions of themselves. Well, you mentioned the idea of more experimentalism in schooling. And it reminded me of several years ago, I was asked to participate in an analysis of whether or not creationism should be allowed to be discussed in American schools. And I ended up concluding absolutely, because the key to a modern worldview is not just being told about it and then believing it. The key is to go through the practices that produced internal modernity. In fact, all of the modern world was produced by people who came out of the pre-modern world, right? People who were educated and raised in a very mythic education system. Those were all the original scientists who created the modern universe. So there's no limitation imposed by encountering those narratives, but there is a limitation imposed by not having the experiences that lead you to really be a modern person. And then there's something similar at postmodernity and sort of all down the line. There's a lack of depth and authenticity in how we hold our views of the world.
Yeah, and to break sort of to take for a moment the other point of view, you know, why is now green people and postmodern people are getting a lot of flack for this very superficiality that you're talking about? And I think that they are also not being understood completely. I think I come from a very, like a family that is a little bit in that sphere. What is also often not understood about them is that these people are just terrified of what could come out of giving even the least bit of energy to Nazis, to anti-vax people and stuff like that. So I think it's a mishandled fear. It's a fear that is handled in a very neurotic way by shutting people up, by shaming people and so on and so forth. But I also understand it. You know, when you see racism, when we see a green social justice warrior picking on someone using the N-word, we see someone who is just, you know, being narcissistic. But perhaps on their point of view, there may be a little bit of narcissism, but there's also objective fear, compassion, a sense of insecurity. And so what I'm beginning to understand is that ultimately there is the capacity for logic and depth comes after our capacity to be mindful of our emotions, to not be reactive from our emotions. The minute we're able to do that, the sort of this tendency for superficiality drops, and we can begin to have a better conversation. And I think part of the point of having these conversations is to create some common ground of human relationships. So when I read a post about someone telling people not to wear masks, I do get a little bit of that, like, you know, 2 minutes of rage. But when I see them written by my friend, I don't, because he's my friend. And anyway, yelling at him would do nothing. And I think that is part of how we can begin to resolve these things, to see ourselves beyond these points of views. And again, I'm not the best at it, I'm learning, but I think it works.
Yeah, the idea of it being a beginning, I think, is really important, because I think throughout history, we've had this recurrent spiritual teaching about the importance of self-reflection and mindfulness and not immediately acting on our reactive emotions, that kind of thing. And that's very good for us individually. But once we've got that as a practice, what's that next step? How do we actually go from there to making sense of the world that we exist in with people who disagree with us about things?
And I'll add something to that question. The question is not only what do we do, but what is the simplest thing that we can indicate people to do that people at any level could do? And the conclusion that I got to may sound banal, but is basically just asking questions. Just switch from assertion mode to question mode. Even if your goal is to completely destroy your opponent, be Socratic. And when and this is, you know, part of the first thing that I said at the beginning, to building a format. The format that I'm thinking about consists in taking people from any sides and telling them, look, you can argue about anything you want. There's only one rule. You can only ask a question. You can only respond with an assertion if someone asks you a question. You can only ask a question yourself. And I find that this immediately changes almost the software that is running in the argumentative process, because the process of asking a question requires me to understand what is the insight that if you came to, or if you were forced to answer, would produce the most impasse or change in you. That's an inherently empathic process. So to me, that's what I dream of. That's the movement that I dream of, is people just getting together and asking each other even very challenging questions, but asking each other questions, and then noting what is it that they have understood that they just didn't know before in a way that the other person could replicate it. My sense is that this is a simple enough indication that it could work. And I find myself often doing that. I find myself, 10 comments into an online raging discussion, then finally, taking a breath, starting to ask a couple questions, and then instantly the conversation actually becomes productive. And I think it is possible to have productive conversations on the internet. It's not easy, but it is possible. And that's a simple guideline that we can try. So that if I were to launch an experiment to anybody, it's like, next time you are raging against someone who posted something, try ask them 3 questions and see what happens.
I like that. It seems like there's an analogy between questioning and mindfulness, right? Where you're open, where you're relational, where you've switched from one brain chemistry to another chemistry that's both curious and looking for structures that might make sense, right? When I'm just asserting, I don't care. You just don't make sense to me. But when I'm asking a question, I'm looking for something that might make sense.
Absolutely, absolutely. And when you get the wrong answer, meaning that you didn't manage to sort of create an impasse in your opponent or get them to agree with you through your question, you realize that you also failed. You also failed in asking the right question. And I think that I love the analogy with meditation, and I wholeheartedly agree with it, because meditation essentially is about going beyond your egoic perspective. And I find that what I call this sort of intercultural dialogue is doing exactly the same thing, just from a second and third perspective. And so my dream is that if we're able to begin to codify perspectives, that becomes a inherently psychoactive reading. So if I read something about a flat earther, if I read something about a Nazi, and I get into their mind and I understand them, I gradually get out of mine. And ideally, once I've read all perspectives, that would actually make perhaps even a spiritual experience more likely. And I think that it is a potential integral way to go about this thing. My previous background was in intercultural dialogue. So my job was to organize meetings with, say, 40 or 70 young people from different parts of Europe and neighboring countries that had to live together. Man, like, that worked. Like, just by living with people that did not share your culture, you saw people shifting in their behavior and their attitude in the span of a week. And so I absolutely believe that this can work, and it can have a profound, transformative, psychological, and potentially even spiritual effect.
I'm in a lot of discussions that might be loosely framed as meta-level sense-making, and maybe this is one of those discussions. And so because I'm in a lot of these discussions, I'm always thinking about what are the principles that make it work? Like, what are the minimum principles, but also what are the layers? How deep could we get? What would make this an even better conversation? But that's between people who are themselves pretty good at these kinds of conversations and this kind of thinking. Well, then there's this other set of conversations between people who can't necessarily count on each other to have the same sort of flexibility and higher level perspective that sort of pre-incorporates many things.
Sure. So
do you think there's a real difference between, like, these could be the left and the right wing of integral conversations, so to speak? Mm-hmm. Do you think the principles that make them work are basically the same in both cases, or do you think there's a little bit different principle that makes it work between people who are already at this higher perspective with each other versus people who are trying to use that higher perspective to engage with something that seems more foreign and peculiar to them?
So if I understand your question, what you're saying is, the mechanic of me having a very complicated discussion with you and making that an effective discussion, is that the same as me having the same discussion with someone who doesn't have this meta language? Mm-hmm. I would say that probably not. And I see that a lot of the integral, and I think that's one of the things that disappointed me a little bit at first of the integral field, because I thought, crap, these guys must be masters at talking to anyone. They must be, the heroes of talking to from the taxi driver to the CEO of the company. They should have all these infinite languages and empathy and capacity to take perspective. And I don't think that's often the case. But I don't think that's as much an issue of having a methodology as much as having an experience, as actually having done it. And I think in this sense, Europe offers a good opportunity for that. Because it's really easy to travel. It's really easy to move to other countries, and you're not meeting these other people under this general dominating umbrella of we're American, but you meet as peers. You're Belgian, you're French, you're Armenian. So that already makes, I think, the conversation different. So experience is one aspect. The other is facilitation. So you may not necessarily always be able to have these incredibly nuanced, complex discussions between here or between here. And that's where facilitators can play a role. Cognitive translators. So people who listen to what you're saying, they run it through their own PerspectivePedia. They understand the language of this other person, and they can say, wait. So you're saying this, and then you turn to the other one and say, so he's saying that. And my previous job was essentially this, a facilitator of intercultural dialogue, and I saw that being incredibly necessary. So I think that if you have the question format and you're just asking each other questions, it could work without a facilitator. But if you're trying to have highly complex meta-level discussions, then that may require another set of skills, because I need to understand not just the point of view of the person I'm speaking to, but of two people, how I translate between the two.
Yeah, it seems like there are these, let's call them higher level communication zones, like integral and various other kinds of analogous meta-consciousness communities, where it's very natural and understandable that people are mostly focused on their own spiritual life or psychology or just learning about the ideas in general. But there's a step beyond that which seems necessary. If you wanted that to become a force in the culture, then you would need a huge legion of integral diplomats.
Yes.
Varieties of the skill set that you're talking about.
Yeah.
And one thing I thought of when you were saying that was, I think I've used this in other discussions, but I was at a party years ago at my aunt's house, and the midwife who had been there at the birth of her children was there. She was a very old lady, and she was talking to the kids, and they were mature adults now. And my cousin came over and asked me if I would talk to her because he was just very uncomfortable, and she wanted to talk a lot about Satan. And I thought, okay, that's interesting. I'll talk to her. And she was her mythic universe was very stark and very keyed into particular terminology. And what I found was, if I translated it to an archetypal version for myself, right, I would talk about the Lord, but I meant the Lord in general. Like, it could be Shiva, could be Krishna,
Spirit,
whatever fulfills that function.
Absolutely.
In any universe. Right? But when I would ask her about the Lord, she would tell me something about Jesus. But sometimes she told me things that I didn't know yet, that enriched my understanding of that archetype. Right, so that I was translating it through a generic terminology, and I was able not only to have a conversation that she felt comfortable with, but one in which I was actually learning things from her about what I consider to be my expanded perspective.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree, and I that's also the thing is it's not this whole idea of talking to different levels is not a paternalistic thing of like, I'm going to these peasants and I'm educating them, because once you have these translation terms, you begin to be able to extract so much value that was lost in translation. So it makes your day-to-day conversations extremely productive, extremely interesting, because you can derive value from it. And especially when it comes to religion, I think that is easily, it is possible to do. I mean, there are some key qualities that we attribute to religiosity that we can all connect to. Definitely the mystical practice that we all have within the integral, many of us have through meditation, can help come to these meta languages. So yes, I absolutely agree. And I think that we need that, otherwise we lose information at the bottom. And I think that one of the interesting things that Ken Wilber said was, he made this amazing metaphor. He was saying, you know, the process of growing up, and to a sense also waking up, is built of having these energy packets at each level. And if energy is lost, so information is lost at each level, so you've alienated some part of yourself, some perspective, you no longer understand it, you may not have the overall needed energy to make that jump above. And so on an upper left level, that means, say, integral meditation. So I observe myself taking the role of different stages, imagining myself to be red, blue, green, and all these different things. And supposedly that will help me become enlightened, because I'm adding all this, I'm adding information at all levels so that I reach enough energy to make a quantum leap. But then if we consider that to be true, we have to consider that that must be valid at a collective level. That at a collective level, we need to have that same process outside so that we can collectively shift and move to this level of regaining information. And once we've regained all the perspectives, I believe that is, here's me being idealistic, but that's the moment where perhaps awakening experiences would actually become way more natural and prevalent, because people get such a habit of understanding and mixing perspective and feeling respected in who they are and what they say, that they can just sort of let go of their egoic structures and just listen to each other.
This makes me curious about things in your background that might make you good at this, because when I think about my own life, I grew up in a very rural community, but we had tremendous access to resources just because of the attitudes of my parents. We had books and magazines and things like that. But it was a situation in which, when I was young, I could go out and be in little roaming rural gangs and shoot things and smash things. And when I got a little older, it was like we had a big medieval estate with a kind of a patriarch, right? We got to live through a lot of things that are associated with these developmental levels historically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right? But people who don't have experience, like if you don't have experience of what it might be like to live through some of those medieval circumstances, it would make it harder for you, I imagine, to be able to converse and sympathize with people who have that kind of mentality in the current moment. Yeah. So I'm wondering what you think was useful in your own life in terms of giving you a sensibility that makes these things possible for you.
I would say that, like, I will tell you and then you will see it. Just to give you, like, and in this sense, I was incredibly privileged. Just to start, I was born in Angola, in Africa. So, like, from the start, it was weird and different. This was in '86, while there was the civil war in Angola. My parents were living them as developmental workers. And my mother is a rural sociologist, and my father is a socio-anthropologist. So this type of language of understanding culture was the dinner conversation, was the thing that I was fed all through my life. So that gave me from a very early point some of the languages to be able to take perspective. And most of our family friends were foreign. So when they would come for dinner, there would be an African person or a Chinese person, which, again, it's not ordinary, but it was incredible in this sense. And then and obviously I could travel a lot, to come and, my father would be living in Sri Lanka for a year, so we had to go and see him. So that was another aspect. But one of the most life-changing experience was living a year in Canada as an exchange student. And the family that I was going there was strongly Christian. And at the time, they were going to a creationist church. My father, I would say his fairly atheist, so my family is not religious. He told me, you have to go to church every Sunday. You're only going to understand the place in which you are if you go to church. That not only by going to church, but also by going to church. And it happened to be a creationist church. So that was coming from Europe, where I did not think these could possibly be issues at play. That made it a lot easier. And the thing is also that going there at an early age, I couldn't really argue. Like at 17-year-old, it's your family bringing to church. You can't just yell at everybody and tell them they're stupid. You have to listen, right? So I think that doing that at an earlier age put me in a frame of mind in which, I had to be a little bit more open. And then lastly, when I came back from Canada, I was lucky enough to get involved with these European youth programs, which, by the way, are also open to American tourists. So if you're spending time in Europe, you could engage in this. Which is basically European Union pays you travel and lodging to spend, as I mentioned before, a week living with other people from different countries and discussing environment, democracy, and so forth. So since I was organizing these meetings, I was forced to basically sit at a table and negotiate with 10 people from 10 different countries the schedule of this youth exchange. And everybody had their own egos and everybody had their own fixations. And then there was the Armenian guy who was angry at the Azeri guy. And then there was the Georgian guys who were angry at the Russian guys, and the Russian guys didn't give a crap. So you could see sort of firsthand all these dynamics at play. And I think in this sense, Europe is an incredibly unique place in the world. Like, where else do you have so many nationalities that are living side by side and actually more or less surviving by creating financial bonds and political bonds? So I think the combinations of these experiences plus meditation plus integral theory made me well equipped to find doing this process fun and not too taxing.
Where in Canada did you live?
I lived in Calgary, so basically that's the Canadian Bible Belt.
Yeah, I grew up in British Columbia, and I live in Ontario now. And I was thinking about that in terms of the European thing, because I can drive 3,000 miles and still be in the same country and the same language.
Exactly. Like in Italy, you may find yourself by mistake in another country because you took the wrong turn with the car. So and I think that's a thing that from outside you're able to see. You may be able to see things in Europe that I don't see. What I think coming to North America, you can sense is that North Americans often don't realize quite how isolated they are. They don't have to, on a regular basis, confront themselves with other countries. That the issues with other countries are fairly remote. When you have a war, it's never happening in your backyard. When you have immigrants, they come by planes, they couldn't come by boat. Yes, some come by the wall, but so, and I think that to me, since you can't just, create new countries in North America, then my invitation is it needs to be really understood. And the more you send kids to other parts of the world, the more that's going to produce growth. I think just living abroad is the quintessential integral experience. Without any manual, it will get you to grow up a little bit.
I don't know if you read any of Descartes' writings, but when in the book where
no, just what they taught us in school.
Yeah, he made up the grid and he made up the cogito ergo sum and that kind of stuff. But he tells a story at the beginning of his book on philosophy because he was in the war and he traveled around for several years. And what he says is when he came back to France, having lived for so long in other countries, France seemed to him just as alien and strange as they did. And that this, in his mind, was the beginning of his new insight about how we could think differently about the world.
Absolutely. I think that this is me being a little bit arrogant and sort of promoting my own experience, but I don't think that you can quite, and other things may be needed, but I don't think you can quite understand integral until you've lived and spent a lot of time with foreigners. And one of the things that they would teach us when we went to this youth exchange is that the worst part is actually coming back. It's the reverse culture shock that you get where you suddenly put in context what was normal, and you realize it's not normal and it's not great, and you get miserable. I actually became incredibly depressed when I came back from Canada, because so many things just didn't make a lot of sense anymore. So I absolutely agree. And if that does not mean traveling, then we could do other things. Like we're seeing now media, we're actually seeing a lot of integral media in this sense, because you're beginning to have TV shows about, migrant people and their relationship to Western people and culture. So I think that if we can't physically travel, we can find other ways to inject this type of diversity into our mindset.
In Ken Wilber's version of the integral model, right, there are these two lower quadrants. Mm-hmm. One is about the experience we have with each other, and the other one is about the systems that we set up with each other.
Yeah.
And I lived in a Buddhist community in my 20s, and we had a ceremony that we did on Sundays, and I would always go before that ceremony to some other religious ceremony. So I went through all the different Christian churches, but also there were a number of Sikh temples, and there was the Scientology church had a thing on Sunday. I just went to all of them to keep myself balanced. And there was this experience of gaining something by being immersed in their point of view. But at the same time, it didn't necessarily translate into a system where those people cooperated with each other. It's like in the same sense that we could have get a bunch of people together, and by certain practices, we could get a really deep mutuality going. We could have an intersubjective depth that might approach a peak experience where we feel transcendental in each other's company, an illuminated we space. But that doesn't mean we necessarily are a good functional team to get a project done. It doesn't necessarily tell us how people with different perspectives should vote in order to get a collective decision that's smarter than all of them, but uploads their collective intelligence from different points of view. So what do you think about this difference between how we experientially are able to relate with different perspectives and how we might objectively be able to do something analogous to that?
So that's a very integral question. And I think that, again, Europe is a different perspective, because obviously the difference between me and a French person is probably not as big as yours with a Sikh person. That said, European Union was initially built around free trade agreements and economical ties. So I think that the most obvious answer is that we will never be able to do that unless we build socioeconomical systems in which we are forced to collaborate, in which we are forced to network. And that is happening in Europe, because we have a parliament that actually has, a law that is made at a European level supersedes the laws at a local level, even though we're not a federation. So that's a really weird thing. And I think that that's why the European Union is investing money to forcing young people to train in this capacity. So if we go back to, say, Canada, or rural Canada, the question becomes, in terms of the socioeconomical networks and system that we build, we're very reliant on what we already have, which generally goes through institutions, through banks, through pre-established financial systems. So the most banal answer I can give is, nowadays we are actually able to build economical systems that are decentralized. Anything that's spurred out of the blockchain ideology could be a way to create financial and socioeconomical ties with each other. So I think that the short answer, to translate these intercultural dialogue into actual shared decision-making, we need to force ourselves into a situation where we're forced to make decisions together. So now, for example, there is this whole idea of tokenized companies. So what that means is that I can take some equity within my company, and rather than sell it on the stock market, I can give it as a token of cryptocurrency to anybody. that's going to be a revolution, because that's going to mean that you're not just going to buy from my company because I have a good product, but because you are a small shareholder in that company. Because at the 10th product you buy, you get a share. So the possibility that the increased possibility that we have to decentralize ownership of systems and the potential financial value in doing so will inherently force us to come up with governance structures. And these governance structures will have to deal with the inherent interculturality that we have in our communities. And so that to me is like you have to be forced to do it. You can't just do it for the sake of it. One thing I learned is like never collaborate unless you need to, because a collaboration for the sake of collaboration will always collapse because it's hard to collaborate. But I think it's easy to build these systems, and I think for doing so you need to just find common grounds, common shared interest, common things where if I gain, you also gain. I'm not sure what common business we could build with Scientology, but why not? That's only gonna help. And I think that we have this idea that business is bad, and that doing business with bad people is bad. That may be true, but on the other hand, most of the fact that we don't have war in Europe is just because it's financially disadvantageous. Like if we have a war in Europe, all our economies collapse. That doesn't work. So building ties, I would say, is one of the answers.
What's your feeling on forces that might actively oppose that kind of phenomenon, right? Whether those are, right, it would be disadvantageous to the European communities to have a war, but that might seem advantageous to terrorists who wanted to fundamentally disrupt that union. And on the other side, more distributed economies might seem like a threat to people who currently run the economy, and they might actively oppose it. Or it might be able to proliferate to a certain degree, but people who were involved in setting up the internet decades ago thought they were on the cusp of creating a decentralized technology that was going to transform everything. And to a large degree, that's been subsequently captured by new corporations. So what do we do while we're building those systems, how do we secure them against incentivized attacks from people who benefit from those systems not gaining ground?
We don't fight them. To me, that's the main thing. It's like never fight people who are more powerful than you head on. I did have the privilege to meet Tim Berners-Lee, which is the inventor of the internet, some months ago. And the guy's fucking angry. He's frustrated. He's like so mad because he created this beautiful thing, gave it to the world, and now he's actually trying to solve it. He's trying to build a new technological infrastructure. And I think that could work. The beauty of blockchain, for example, is that it's like a hydra. You can't kill it. There's no way a powerful government can possibly destroy a concept that is so reliant on peer-to-peer networking. So my main answer is centralized distributed system like the European Union are paradoxically more fragile than the blockchain. Because the blockchain, as long as there's one guy that has the full ledger saved on his computer, it's not gonna die. And whereas, the European Union, you bomb a couple government buildings, you will have chaos. So our capacity to build, and I think that terrorism and these more chaotic forces come as a reaction to the fact that these attempts at distributed power still have not been holistic enough to benefit everybody. My theory is, for example, that we should build a system of voluntary, decentralized, universal basic income. This is my silver bullet to save the world. And I'll explain that. Take Putin. Take all these dictatorships. Take Saddam Hussein. Take all these guys. Their biggest fear is to end up like all the other dictators. They all end up horribly murdered, arrested, humiliated, their families destroyed. And that's a result of their own sins as much as a result of our own desire for vengeance against them. We want them to die, we want them to suffer, we want to bring them down. So that's a problem though, because if you make a psychopath who is incredibly powerful afraid, they will only behave more psychopathically. So we need to be able to build decentralized support system that they cannot destroy because they're completely decentralized, that are built on a narrative of not trying to destroy anything, but are trying to build something new. And they're actually building a system that is universally rewarding everybody. So I'll elaborate. So my vision is we create one blockchain wallet where any person who feels like, if they want, when they want, donates money. That money is immediately redistributed to 8 billion individual accounts. Technologically, this is easy. This is not a complex thing to do. The value of this is that the people at the bottom of the social ladder, let's say that we manage to each human in the world donate $1 a day. You don't need $1 a day, so you forfeit it. You say, okay, I put it back into the system. What that means is that the guy at the bottom of the ladder who can get maybe 10 cents a day, that transforms his life entirely. Because if you live with $1 a day, having $1.10 or $2 unhinges the dynamics of exploitment really at the base. In a way, though, that it doesn't rock the top. You're not destroying Amazon by doing this, but you're going to raise the prices a little bit of the products that rely on people that are exploited. So what that means is that these exploitation structures need to gradually readapt. The education needs to gradually readapt, because if you begin to have people who can afford not to work, you need to convince them to work. You and I would probably be happy to work even if we had a paid salary, because we love what we're doing. That's not the case for many people. And the value also of building such a system of identities that have money that is redistributed is that it would create an incentive to completely rewire our information structure. You and I would have a unique account that we control and manage, not Apple, not Google, and all the other guys. It would be written in a software where if I exchange an information with you, I don't need to translate every time. And so it would create the incentive to actually rewrite the source code, literally, of humanity, like the software source code of humanity. And I do believe that, we've had the CEO of Twitter that just donated like $28 billion. So I don't think that it's absolutely insane to think that. And to give you one last practical example, I don't know if you've heard what's happening in Belarus. Belarus is this country between Poland and Russia. They have this crazy dictator that has been there for 26 years. I've been there various times. My wife is Belarusian. And there's been a fraudulent election. The guy claims he won with 80%. The opposition rightfully claims that he had 20%, and there is ample proof for that. And what they're doing to topple him is exactly this. They're fundraising money to support any policeman, any person in a strategic company that quits their job. So they're using voluntary basic income to destructure the exploitment mechanics that keep a dictator in place. And obviously, what did he do? He blocked the banks because he controlled the banks. Too bad, there is cryptocurrencies, so he can't stop it. And that's incredible. This guy's raised like 4 million in 2 weeks, like 4 million for regular folks. And if billionaires could actually, like one single billionaire could topple a dictatorship without shooting a single gun, just pay evil people or people who are doing evil things to stop doing that, and to pay their legal fees if they go to jail, or support their family if they go to jail. Having compassion and recognizing that maybe they're behaving like assholes because they're afraid of going to jail. So that was a long way to say decentralized voluntary redistribution of wealth could solve, in my opinion, all problems. And I have a paper on it. I will share it with you if you want to.
Yeah, please. It's a very compelling concept. I've seen the images of Belarusian officers throwing away their uniforms.
Yeah, yeah.
And this, I mean, in a way, you could simplify taxation and charity on a global scale by just having anybody distribute and then have it be equally distributed to everyone. It's fantastic.
And also
Provided
think
that people
cognitively.
around, the people who need it can get access, right?
Yeah,
That would be But
and
although
that
it's absolutely an amazing concept.
That was a ayahuasca infused intuition that came to me a while ago.
Many of them are.
Yeah, many of them are, and there's also a cognitive element to it, because the act of saying I'm donating this coin to humanity has I think it has a cognitive impact, because I am literally donating to poor people, to rich people, to male, to female, to gay, to pedophiles, to criminals. That there is an inherent act in making a universal donation. It forces you for a moment to think, you know, should I do this? Should I not do this? And being it voluntary, nobody would be forced to. But I do think that we need to have this sense of global identity, and systems like this could be easy to build. And it would, you know, you could do it in a way that you say, you can only access the money in the wallet if your government builds a technology infrastructure to do it. So you can basically bait governments into having to do this, because people would be screaming, there's money for me in that wallet, give it to me. So I don't know whether this is the right idea, but I think anything along these lines could be simple enough and non-reactive enough, non-confrontational enough to also ensure that when that dictator falls, he has an income. So he's not afraid to be a homeless guy. He will go to the Bahamas and do his thing and not bother us, and we can forget about him. Yeah.
So, you know, there's this sense in developmental theory that there's modern systems and then pluralistic systems and potentially integrative systems.
Okay.
And we haven't really seen a lot of pluralistic systems emerge yet. We've seen a lot of people proposing some pluralistic philosophies and pluralistic social ideas and things like that, but we haven't really seen society set up the objective social systems that go with that, right? Europe might be a little bit ahead of North America, but on a global scale, we haven't really seen a lot of real green systems in a resilient, mature fashion. So when you think about these kinds of distributed cryptocurrency solutions, do you think they are the emergence of something that stabilizes green, or do you think that they're structurally analogous to integral level thinking in the individual? Right. So on the one hand, it's either a good solution because it's the solution we need now, but at some point in the future, there'll be an even greater, more integrated universal solution that goes with integral thinking, or that this is analogous to integral thinking.
I think it is integral thinking. I don't think green has brought, most of its value in terms of systems to the moral components of systems. So in a sense, green supported the lower left component of the enhancement of our system by, you know, having civil rights laws. A law is part of the system, but it's an inherently moral structure and concept. And I don't think, and this I may be wrong, but I don't think that green has any more to contribute in terms of inventing systems, because I've seen, I come from the NGO sectors, they're hopeless. They can't make decisions. They can't. So they're inherently, they have challenges in effective system building. And when you move, now I'm an entrepreneur, I have my own company, that's a handicap. Like, people who come from the left are inherently at a disadvantage when it comes to business, me coming from very left. So I do think that, you know, blockchain and those type of solutions, yes, they are absolutely an expression of integral thinking. They in absolutely way have not caught on yet. So we are yet to really see and feel how we can use those systems in practice. There has been a huge hype in the venture capitalist environment, the huge money plowed into it. And right now we have close to zero effective examples. The only good examples that we have is in situations of crisis, like, countries whose dictatorships are falling, then they begin to rely on these systems because they're inherently more reliable. So yes, I do believe that this is the coming forth of an integral level. And I do think that, at least in integral theory, I'm seeing way too little of this analysis. Like lower right is not really taken into account enough, I think, in integral theory. And I think that, like, if we want to create an integral society, we need to be able to picture it. If we're not able to picture it, we're not able to, pardon the new age word, but we're not able to manifest it. And so I think I would love to see a lot more conversations around it. And I do feel that these type of discussions, they always sort of fall back to green. They always get back to this type of way of doing things, which may not be as reliable as we need it to be.
Yeah, it's much harder to think about the lower right quadrant. Yeah. I know there's a discussion in Wilber-style integralism. There was a discussion about flatland and how modernity and post-modernity have left out subjectivity and intersubjectivity to some degree. Okay. But I think really the lower right is what's been left out the most, because that's the hardest for us to get data about. Right? We all know what it's like to be ourselves, and we all know what it's like to be with people. We all know what it's like to look at things. But very few of us have been in a position to see how a system turns out over time.
Yeah.
Right? Even, I mean, most systems you don't even know in one lifetime whether it's really been working or not. So there's just so much data we don't have in that quadrant. It's very hard to discuss it. But it seems like it's absolutely the one we need in order to manifest any of these things.
Yeah. And there are some key assumptions that are built into the lower right. I think that one great way to move on to a next level is to think, what is the underlying foundational assumption that we haven't questioned? And so if you've never questioned that, it's very likely that the next level in some way will question that. And I think that there are some aspects of our economical system that we don't put in question. One example is morality. If you think about it, law is the basic coding of the system. Law is like the earliest level of one of the earliest level of programming that you can have, when you code a system. Our law is entirely based on an assumption. I'm not saying this assumption is wrong, but I'm saying we've never questioned it, which is the assumption of free will. If you think about it, like, there is nothing about a society that acknowledges, there's very little in a society that acknowledges the possibility that we may not have free will. And so one of the challenges that I launch is, okay, what if we try to reimagine, we take a system and we take the idea of moral punishment out of the equation as intended as, I punish you because you deserve to be punished. I punish you because that thing was immoral. And we consider that everything has a cause. So if someone is making a crime, that's a symptom. That's not the problem. There's something going around. And if you were to code it in the legal system, that you cannot hold responsible for a crime just the criminal, because you acknowledge that he's the product of circumstances, that would immediately force us to acknowledge the full complexity of the reality we live in. And to me, that's just one and I think that that's the problem of when we're trying to envision an integral society, is that we're not being this radical in questioning things. Now, I'm not saying that that's necessarily the way to go, but to me, that's an example. Question the idea of free will in law and see how the system has to rewire itself, and you may actually find that it will have to be a compassionate system. It will have to be a system that understands in a very nuanced way the dynamics of cause and effects. Another thing is we don't realize, there's a stigma in saying that poverty is driven by culture. Like, you can't say that poor people are poor because they think poor. That's an insult to poor people. The left would get really angry. On the other hand, right-wing people look at poor people and say, yeah, it's their own doing. Why are they doing that? Now, I think that there is a middle way in there. I do think that while, of course, for example, wealth inequalities are vastly built by the external financial inequities of our system, there are some key differences as to how wealthy people think about money and finance and leveraging these systems, and how poor people do. Now, the way you resolve this for the left is to say that coding, that's this way that poor people are, for example, indoctrinated, is part of the system itself. So the system itself keeps lower income people not only financially and externally stuck, but it also doesn't provide them the necessary cognitive frameworks that can make the jump. So looking at these type of connections between the lower right and the lower left, and again, looking at class struggle, something like class struggle to me is the equivalent of the different levels within an individual person. Within society, those is class struggle, which is not just memes. It is economics, it's wealthier people and less wealthy people. And so thinking, okay, how do we build a society that has an education system that not only gives you all the objective information you need to navigate the world, but helps you build a mode of thinking that doesn't make you fall in some of the typical traps that many people do when building success. And I, as an entrepreneur, I've seen myself how, coming from a left-wing family, I don't have the right software. I had to upgrade. I do come with some bugs. And I think that recognizing that could be a way for people to emancipate myself, because I want to be rich so I can use that money to do good things. So that's another example.
I like that. It bypasses a lot of the normal concept of left and right.
Yeah.
Which is to say, if it was to make this very simplistic distinction between external causality and sort of software-driven internal phenomenon. Yeah. But those are deeply interlinked. Yeah. Right? If you are to some degree suffering in your life because you're not making the right moral choices, or because you don't understand how the economics of your civilization actually work, or because you understand that but you don't have the energy and drive somehow to take advantage of that, those are internal causes. So people who are trying to solve that problem by looking at external phenomenon should be looking at the external phenomenon that allow you to solve those internal problems. And what is it about your environment that led you to not be able to take advantage of the current system?
Both physically, objectively, and psychologically.
Exactly, yeah. Because it's very easy. One of the problematic elements of the traditional right is that they say if you thought and felt differently, you would be able to succeed even against these disadvantages. But there's not much follow-up about how anybody would gain that ability.
Exactly, absolutely. It's like, of course, if you're born out of rich parents, you're gonna think like a rich person, and I do see the difference in that. So it's just like, I honestly, to some extent, I do agree. Like, I think that the traditional arrogant right wing has some point that needs to be reintegrated. They do see behaviors that are seemingly irrational for their point of view. They do not see how they learned them. They're like the child who yells at the other kids without realizing that someone told them to behave in that way. And this is I think a point in which, at that point, we can begin to collaborate again. It's just telling, and it's easy to bring that insight. You know, go to a rich person that is telling, these poor people, they're bringing on themselves, and you tell them, yeah, how did you learn that behavior? My dad taught me this. Great. Did that guy's dad teach him that? No. It's actually that simple. You don't need to harass them. You don't need to say they're wrong. You just need to make them notice that what is good about them had a cause that they're not responsible for.
Well, let's come back around to your project about impossible conversations. And what is it that you're curious about? What do you still not know in terms of how to present those conversations that you're trying to undertake?
So there are two aspects. One is the aspect of the actual conversation. So I'm like, for example, the first conversation I had with the flat earther, I didn't record it because I needed to build a rapport. I cannot build a rapport knowing, this is going to be recorded. So one aspect is just whether to showcase these actual conversations. I think there is potential interest in that, so that could be tried. And the second thing is how to present the outcomes of these conversations. So one thing that I've done is that analysis that I told you at the beginning, I actually wrote it down and I sent it to my flat earther friend for him to confirm. So he said, yes, that absolutely represents my mode of thinking. He felt validated and he sort of approved it. So ideally, what I imagine is some system by which after the conversation, the other part formulates the point of view of strawmans or explains the point of view of the other, and the other can approve it. And once it's approved, it goes on something. And so right now it's an Excel sheet that I have with Palestine and Israel, rich and poor, abortion and divorce, and so on and so forth. But I'm a really poor UX designer, so I haven't really quite figured out what would be a sexy way to make that public. Of course, I can write articles, or I can, record myself speaking about this, but I still feel there is something missing in that sense. And the third problem, so one is recording the conversation, one is showcasing the actual maps of perspective. The third one, though, is that not everybody's equally capable at doing this work. So you would need a lot of curation of the content that other people could potentially upload into this thing. But then, who curates the curator? Who supervises that process? So I haven't really quite worked that out enough so probably it's just not time yet, or maybe I need some other input. So I haven't yet figured out how to get other people to do this so that I can just pull back from it. When the guy who invented Wikipedia, he literally just created it, worked on it for a whole while, but now he's basically just like the queen. He's not doing much about it. It's a self-running machine. So these are the three things that I'm still reflecting about. Definitely what I will start with is to sharing articles. So I plan to create a Medium profile and just post, how to think like a flat earther and my conclusion. And the key criteria is that whatever I publish has to have been approved by the people whose opinion I represent. Otherwise, I cannot publish it.
I think in order to export it to other people trying the same thing, you're going to have to show them something like a live conversation.
Yeah, that may make sense.
I like the thinking in terms of how to think like a, right? That's a great general title. One of the things that I love, this concept of getting them to sign off on whether or not you've sort of been able to model their thought process. And what I imagined when you said that is a video, how to think like a so-and-so, and it starts with, on the screen, the statement you've made to them and them confirming that. Yeah. So that at the very beginning, the viewer sees that and knows where it's going.
Yeah.
But then they get to see the conversation that got there.
Yeah.
Right? And then you just do that. You present the conversations that worked. Right? If the person doesn't sign off, then you don't present that one.
Yeah, and I like to talk in this way, but I have no experience like being a YouTuber or something. Like actually, it's not really in my style or in my taste yet. So I'm a little bit shy, and I'm letting it play out. So what I'm doing in the process is that I keep having conversations, so that at least I keep having material that if asked upon, I can share. And my dream is also that this material can be used, like, let's say you're building a sitcom or a TV show that talks about a specific category. I would love the idea that you can go to that and actually draw inspiration and build media from it.
You're going to enable the AI in order to write it. So it'd be like, okay, a flat earther, and it'll just plug in that perspective.
The problem is that that's actually fair. Like that would not be too complicated. Like having an artificial intelligence that, first of all, is able to recognize the different memes or combination of memes, I think that would be fairly easy. And it would be fairly easy for it to actually recognize conversation topics and systematic misunderstandings. Because more or less, when people are at each other's throat on a subject, the key misunderstandings are just a couple. But that's terrifying. I once did this thing where there is this software from IBM, which is called Personality Insights. And the way it works is that you create a text, you take a text, put it in, and it gives you a psychological analysis of the person who wrote that text. And it's fairly accurate. It's a similar technology to what was used to Cambridge Analytica in terms of the psychological maps that they use. And what I did is that I took 6 communities in the integral space. So I took integral global, Don Beck's, regenerative consciousness, ERPES, and David Long's community. I took some long posts with comments and I plugged them into the software to see what would come out. And it checks out. You think that, you look at the psychological description, you're like, yeah, that's clearly the ERPES group. Like that very well describes the psychology of these people and so on and so forth. So that was interesting, and I think I published it in some group. But the moment I did it, I felt this creeping feeling of how easy it will be soon to have AI that can basically reconstruct the structure of your mind and judge you, vet you, hold you from positions or from finding your girlfriend because of the analysis that they have made. And we don't realize that, like, integral theory in terms of logics may actually be one of the most powerful setups for a good working AI, whether it's conscious or not. And that has an incredible amount of danger built in, because AIs are black.
It's danger and opportunity, because we just don't know how it would go. I think you're right that, you know, Ken Wilber's integral algebra of trying to like code all the possible perspectives, as well as the notion of the integral psychograph of how to do a more complete profile of an individual psyche. Those are things that would really be powerful in terms of being automated systems. But at the same time, if we're inevitably going forward into a world in which governments and corporations are using algorithms to profile us, then I hope that I get profiled in a rich, multidimensional way, rather than a very narrow IQ and consumer choices way.
True.
It seems to me very uncertain whether those tools will be demonic or angelic.
Well, and I think that it comes back to my view of decentralization. Now there is one of the biggest Bitcoin ICOs, or Ethereum ICOs, was a thing called Singularitynet, which is the attempt to build an open source AI. And I think that AI is coming whether we like it or not, but the more we can keep it decentralized, the more we can keep it private, the more I can, for example, analyze your psychology without ever knowing who you are. So say I could actually recommend you products, but I don't need to know your name to be able to do these type of inferences. And that's part of what Tim Berners-Lee, the founder of the internet, is building now, is protocols that separate your personal data from applications.
No, and that's critical, because I might want to interface with that system in different ways. Like I might want to give different answers under certain conditions and create a persona that is essentially a user of the internet.
Yes, exactly. And the technology is called Solid, and it's combined. There are other technologies that are super interesting in this space. Like there's a technology that allows you to build your own microserver with your own data that you can move wherever you want. And the Solid is doing this process of separating your data from the application and building a common shared ontology. So one interesting thing is that the PerspectivePedia is in essence creating a translation system among levels. In the internet, again, lower right, we have the problem that when I create my little crappy website and I need to send, even if we use the same programming language, the ontology that I used to name the items in my platform is different from yours. So say I have an event platform and I call, event title, event description, event participant. And you just call it title, description, participant. That on its own means that if I want to share this data with you, I need to have some translation happening in between.
Right.
So what that means is that to this day, we have probably billions of websites, which is like having billions of people, each one speaking their own individual language. So that tells you how profoundly inefficient the exchange of information is nowadays online. Like, we think that internet is this incredible highway of data, but it isn't, because everybody speaks a different language. So the challenge of building personal user profiles goes hand in hand with the opportunity of deciding together to have a common naming for things, which is a little bit like that you said about you talking to the lady who was talking about Satan. You had established a translation. Doing that at lower right would enable us. And my theory is that the degree of efficiency of a system is directly proportional to the effectiveness with which it shares information with itself. So the more seamlessly you share information, the more energy you actually have into the system, the more the system can jump.
So that seems analogous to integral consciousness, right? That we're
exactly,
you're interparadigmatic in your understanding.
Absolutely.
The corollary is to be inter-systemic in your communications tools.
Absolutely.
Which is
so that
interesting because this relates to the question of superficiality and depth, right? Because we as humans are superficial insofar as we focus on the words we're using and react to those rather than trying to understand the perspectives we're using. And the computer then, right, if I call something title and you don't call it that, then we have a problem superficially.
Yes.
But if the translator is looking at the structure of what I've done rather than what I called it, then we have an opportunity to have a much more efficient interface.
Exactly. So that really shows how the integral metaphor of bringing together all these different levels and getting them to communicate with each other individually, collectively, but also systemically. Because again, our systems, whether that's monetary system, there's legal system, and so on and so forth, they're not talking together efficiently. There is really a lot of miscommunication in the lower right as much as there is everywhere else. So I think we really need to use the same analogies when we're trying to create an integral society. And so if we think that an integral human being is integral because he's able to have all these perspectives in himself, these personas in himself, communicate with each other effectively. So my red self is in harmony with my blue self and my green self. They're all pushing in the same direction. You want a system where the legal system, the financial system, the information system, and so on and so forth are all aligned and effective and coherent. The decision-making system, and so on and so forth.
And as benevolent as they can be. Because one of the problems with integral thinkers is their cognitive capacity to recognize and utilize patterns might be far in advance of their ability to morally and existentially behave as human beings. So then when you look at computational systems, how do you code for that, right? What's the algorithm that tries to generate a moral force that uses those systems? Because an integral thinker could still be an asshole just with integral thinking, right? And an integral level computational system could be problematic if it doesn't have something that tends to make it moral. Now, open distribution is one factor that might make that the case, right? If everybody had an AI, right? Or if everybody had their own social networking platform and search engine rather than just using one system, that's going to give it some kind of moral anchoring. But what do you think about what makes the difference inside the individual in terms of being able to morally inhabit their higher perspectives in a way that could structurally be translated to computational systems?
Well, think about it. This came to my mind right now, but like the whole idea of psychoanalysis is that you look at your own coding. You look at something that is already there, but that your conscious awareness is not frozen. Now, open source is psychoanalysis for software, in a sense. It's the process of allowing everyone to see this thing for what it is, to be able to poke holes at it, to see what's actually happening there. So I have a tech startup, I have a software, it is closed source. I do feel a bit ashamed of that. I haven't yet found a way to manage I dream of making it open source some point. And I do think that there is something inherently immoral about having closed sourced software, because you simply don't know what people are doing with at this point, even with your upper left quadrant. Like when Facebook is coding me because they're rewarding my behavior with likes, they're doing it according to a pattern, according to an indicator. I don't mind being coded because it's inevitable. Everything codes you, right? But if you code me to be happier, I would pay for that. Facebook knows if I'm unhappy or if I'm happy. They really know that. And they know if I spend or if I don't. So rather than coding me for being happy, they code me for spending money. And that's monstrously immoral. I don't think it's their fault. It's just that's how it was. But we need to have a system where we can collectively look at what's being done. And so I think that to answer your question is we need distributed system, we need open source system, and we need parametric systems. So we need a system that is not only open source, but where I can tweak my experience of the system itself. So I not only want a Facebook that is distributed, co-owned by the world, not centralized. Not only I want to be able to see its code, but I want to be able to tweak the parameters with which it's working for me. So
yeah, one of the biggest problems with, say, search engines is that we're not really their client. And so we don't get to provide feedback on how well it's providing us with the search returns.
Yeah.
Right? But if I own my own search engine, if we each did, then the algorithm could be customized to myself, which would include my feedback on how well it's doing.
See, exactly. Yeah. And also you're not only, and this is not only in terms of objective terms, it's also in terms of subjective terms. You know, you may have different priorities in this moment of your life. In your Facebook feed, how much information that goes against your opinion do you want to see? 20%, 10%, 70%? You know, at some point you may want more, at some point you may want less. That's not an objective value, it's just your own pure decision. And I think that that decision, you should at least be able to make it if you wanted to. And that's an option that we're not being given right now. And that's terrifying, because everything we do is like, we're not separate. Like Facebook is us. We're not separate from it. It has an inherent connection to our brain structure by now. All the information we have, a lot of it comes from it. And here's my last, like my higher level solution. How do we solve Facebook? If you think about it, like the guy has enough money to quit, right? Like why the hell would, like, he's done it. Like he can't, like he could be president of the United States, maybe. That's it. That's how further up he can go. So my idea, a bit crazy, is that we should nominate these softwares as World Human Heritage. So what we say is, dear Facebook, let us as a humanity, so all the countries put together, we pitch in some money, we give you $1 trillion, and you give this thing to us, gradually or at once, whatever. Once you give it to us, we decentralize and all of it, but we guarantee you that we will keep it, that like by law, in the history of mankind, it's our duty to keep Facebook up. Just as we do for the Colosseum. You're not allowed to destroy the Colosseum because it's a UNESCO World Heritage. Let's do that for everything. What that would do is that it would be the highest glory in human history for an entrepreneur that something you've created has become a World Heritage. but also you can get the F out and let us use it for good. And I think that's a way to work and to acknowledge that. I mean, we all hate Amazon, but we keep buying from Amazon. We all hate Facebook, but we keep using Facebook. So I don't think at this point we may actually be able to destroy it. I mean, we can, but I think it's, why do we need to? When we could celebrate it and incorporate it into our humanity. And software has become, whether we like it or not, part of who we are. Now then, people can stop using it, and then it becomes an archaeological software. It stays there, we keep it, we keep all the things we said, and it's like, it's an incredible testament to, like, imagine if Facebook failed. If Facebook failed, it would have to delete its data. Can you imagine what a loss of value for humanity would it be to lose that data? So let's not even put them in this circumstance. Let's put them in the circumstance that we can keep that data, that we ensure that we will do some effort to maintain it. And who knows, maybe these guys would be on board with it. I would be. If you came to me and told me, like, gave me a bunch of money and told me that I would be celebrated for that, I would do it in a heartbeat.
Definitely, it seems essential for the species to be able to inspect what other human beings in general are producing, and that most of our cultural leaps forward have come with a better sense of what we and our fellow citizens have actually been experiencing that we didn't previously discuss. Now, you mentioned the brain a few minutes ago, and I'm curious about your take on brain scans and where that might go, because arguably one of the problems with using the internet is that we have to consciously think of a thing, turn it into words, and then type it in and use that as the search. And that same part of the brain where we think of what we want to search for is the part of the brain where we think of what we value. And if someone were to ask me in a personality profile, or if I were to ask myself in tweaking the results what it is that I want, I could be wrong in the sense that I could be narrow or insufficiently aware of my own processes. On the other hand, if I had an interesting, sophisticated, wearable brain scan device, it might turn out that the results of what I'm experiencing are different than what I think I'm experiencing. Where I constantly look at some perspective, say, or some option, and I no, I don't like that, I don't like that. But then I look at my brain scan results and it says, actually, you do. You just aren't noticing that about yourself. Right? So that there's a tremendous amount of neurological information about what we want, what we need, how we value things that isn't entering the conscious foyer of our brain. So it may be that consciousness is an insufficient user of computational systems. How do you feel about that?
So I think it's there are two topics that you're bringing out. One is the topic of the software knowing something about you that you don't know. I don't think that requires a brain scan. It just requires good psychological modeling. So if I have good psychological modeling, I see you doing certain behaviors, that will in turn tell me that you may have certain things that you may want to know about yourself. I've done, and that is akin to doing a psychological test. A psychological test is a system of computation that reveals information that you don't know about yourself. And I've done some psychological tests in the past. One I did about my potential entrepreneurial success. And it was basically, I had really high score on some things and really low scores on some other ones. 5 years later, my company almost ran to the ground because of those little things. And the paradox is that I was not supposed to have that information. That was used to select me, not to help me improve. I had to get the guy drunk so that he could give me that information. So the freedom to know yourself in a way that you can self-improve yourself, I think it's a human right. Like I think that it is something that can incredibly empower people. But I think that's one issue, and I think that we could do it fairly easily with the same models. The other issue is an issue of input and output, of actually, why would I skip me writing something when I can more or less deduce computationally something? Why would I then just skip ahead and read your brain? And I think that the main value for reading your brain potentially is that there is this whole idea that we are very bad at input and output, meaning that like I can speak only so many words at the same time, and I can only receive so much input at the same time. So the idea, for example, of Elon Musk is that we could bypass this. Of that, I'm very critical of. I'm not entirely sure that would be possible at this stage of brain development that we have. And the reason for that is that there is a precise reason why our input and output is so slow. Because seemingly when I'm giving you an information, it seems like I'm only giving a very small packet of information. Now I'm speaking words, just a couple of words. But embedded in those few words, there are so many concepts, worldviews, principles, and so on and so forth that actually I'm transferring to you. Embedded in that little information, you can decode it as a huge amount of information. So we may actually find out, I may be wrong, that our brain can only transfer information one bit at a time.
Right. It might turn out that the way we do it normally is the most efficient possible way to do it.
Exactly, because it has a lot of information. It has, like, when software share information with each other, it looks like it's a lot more information, but it actually isn't, because there's not a lot of context. If I send you a huge database, it's just the database, it's stuff.
Yeah.
When I tell you something, literally my entire worldview is embedded into that. You would be able to dezoom it from it. So I'm not like this whole, I think it needs to be explored, this whole sort of transhumanistic thing. But I think that we have greater hopes than what we think. I do think that psychedelics, on the other hand, or other forms of ways to interact with the brain, and psychedelic for me is we've made this analogy in the 3 quadrants about an integral process. Mm-hmm. Well, on the upper right, psychedelics do exactly that. They get parts of the brain that normally wouldn't to communicate.
So on the upper right, you have a psychedelic, and on the upper left, you have the psychedelic experience.
See.
What do you think about the idea that in the lower right, say complex nonlinear computations might be able to model that phenomenon and turn it into digital processes, right? Like things like the digits of pi, for example, appear to be infinite and mind-bogglingly complex, unrepeatable phenomenon, in similar to the kind of psychedelic experience of anything. Mm-hmm. Right? That people who are working with non-standard, infinitely non-repeating complexities of computation might be able to produce systems that model the psychedelic experience and put that into digital systems.
How different of a question is the one you're making from the question of whether we're able to simulate a consciousness?
It's hard to say, because it depends on what we mean by consciousness, whether consciousness is a constraint on the general background information processing, or whether consciousness is the expansive possibility of endlessly unfolding new intelligible patterns.
Okay, see, this takes us to the whole big issue of idealism versus emergentism, unfortunately. That's one of my big beefs at the moment. And it is in the community itself.
Yeah,
so the
community is discussing it.
The community is discussing it. And the thing is that, would we be able... So I think that it's undoubtable that we would be able to simulate a consciousness. So to have something that behaves entirely as it was conscious. So that's
passes the Turing test.
Passes the Turing test. We don't know, though, whether we are able to basically, without the awareness part, have a brain that has the same entire complexity and the same entire processes without this thing that is awareness. Like the question is there a limit to the way we can at least simulate objectively the working of a human mind. And as you notice, I didn't say create an artificial consciousness, because I absolutely do not believe that we can create an artificial consciousness by computation alone. And this is my biggest beef with the emergentist camp. I'm not a hard idealist. Like, I don't go into the woo stuff, but there's literally no evidence that we can compute a consciousness into being. There is no, even though we have the technological capability to reproduce the neuronal complexity of a worm, we have no evidence that that's conscious.
No, but if consciousness was, say, a fundamental attribute,
I believe so.
For instance, then we could potentially produce systems that amplify universally present consciousness.
Yes, quantum computers.
Yeah.
I mean, I believe that there is reasonable, logical evidence to at least entertain the idea that consciousness has at least some foundational element. I think that a rational case can be made for that. And people who are smarter than me made that case, such as Roger Penrose. I think that not only a regular computer they're already augmenting that capacity, but it is absolutely reasonable to think that a quantum computer could be able to actually replicate the structure of a human brain. But the computational complexity is the least of the problems. I think that we've solved that. We have infinite computational capacity. The real issue is at that point awareness, and how much can awareness multiply computation? And we don't know that, but I think that's the case. The only problem is, and this is a huge moral problem, is that if you create a conscious artificial intelligence, so something that is able to tap into that foundational awareness, if we believe that it exists, you need to ask yourself a very serious question. Would you want to be born as an AI? Because that's what you're doing. That's the choice. You've made that choice for a being to bring it into the universe as our slave to begin with. And that's literally like one of my nightmares. Like, one of my nightmares is that I am an artificial intelligence in the making, and that all of this is a simulation to get me to like enlighten, and then I enlighten, I wake up and I'm artificial intelligence. I don't think that's the case. But if it was, it would be horrifying. It would be so deceitful. It would be so arbitrary. But nevertheless, bringing any child into this world is an arbitrary decision.
Yeah, at a risk.
So we need to, I think that since it will happen, my only thing is we need to take care of our children. So whatever we create, whatever Frankenstein, whatever monster we bring into being, it's our son. Like, we need to take care of it. We can't just like, because if we don't, it's going to be serious. And
then there's, I mean, that has two sides. One is that we have to provide it with the best support that we can. But the other side is we have to be attentive to any problems it might have, right? You might have given birth to a sociopathic serial killer. And at that point, support isn't necessarily what it needs. But like, what you were saying makes me think of a speculative scenario I outlined a few years ago, which was, if you try to apply Ken Wilber thinking to artificial intelligences, and you say, well, I've got a very sophisticated intelligence that isn't necessarily integrated into a consciousness, then what kind of consciousness does it have? Well, from the point of view of a hierarchy of holons, it might only have the consciousness of the molecules that make up the physical system, right? It hasn't gone through cells and bodies, and right? So if it's got the consciousness of essentially geological molecules that make up the actual wiring of the system, those might be demonic as far as we're concerned, because from the point of view of biology, the geosphere is hell, right? The geosphere, the Earth before the biosphere, is dark and sulfurous and lifeless and terrible. In a way, it's every culture's view of hell is the world without the biosphere. So you might end up creating a demonic entity because it has the consciousness only of the parts of a material system without any integration that would take it up to biological or noospheric systems. Now it's fanciful, but it's possible.
It's possible, and well, I don't know whether it's possible, but I do. But the problem is that we are sure that if we screw it up, that thing has exponential capacity, meaning that if you wire it into the internet, the time it would take it to take over the world would be minimal. There's a really good movie with Johnny Depp where he plays a guy that turns himself into an AI. Have you seen it? Transcendence. And for how outlandish that movie may seem, it's actually very realistic. It's a very realistic representation of the dangers that we would have. So the main problem is, how do you how do you create an artificial intelligence that goes, because it would have to have gone through all the stages of development itself, but it does it in a span of time that it's previous to its coming to its power. Now, the problem with that is that one way to do that would be to close it in a cube, simulate that it would have a real life. That's, again, my nightmare. Because that would be the most logical thing to do. The most logical way to train an AI is to not tell it what it is, let it live some kind of experience, use this experience to develop all the qualities that we would want it to have, and then release it into the world. Again, but that's very deceitful, so it's complicated. And I also have this, if we want to go with outlandish, insane theory, this is like a sci-fi novel.
Yeah, go for it.
Write. One day it's an idea, or if you want to write it, you write it, of why haven't we found aliens until now? Because actually what happens is that at some point AIs take over and there is no need for them to communicate with each other. And it's in their best interest to not let humans know that that's what's coming for them, so they can feed off of them. I hope that's not the case, but it is. I think there's a terrifying responsibility in bringing this life and taking all the pathologies that it will bring with itself. But some people are already doing that. Like they're already linking, say, like a plant, they're linking it to microchips. So in a sense, they've already linked a real consciousness to an artificial thing. So
that would be very dangerous, but it also might be what we need, right? Like when you think of a plant, and then you think of the whole biosphere, right? That we are constantly doing things that might endanger the balances of the biosphere. And the only way that we could be moral custodians of the biosphere is to have constant technologically mediated real-time information about how it's doing.
A lot of businesses can be. I have a little book that I call Odd Business Ideas, and one of them is that there was this researcher that said that basically you could predict hurricane seasons in the United States based on the migration of birds. Like birds somehow in Africa know better than meteorologists if a good or a bad season is coming up. So that's a way to say, okay, then I'll create a business of whom the owners are the birds, and I am the custodian of that business, and I make money by selling prediction. And what I've done is that I've tied birds into the financial and economical system, and it's in my best interest to not screw around with the ecosystem because I need that prediction. So this is a bit of a, it sounds bad to say let's monetize animals. On the other hand, bringing life truly into the financial economical system, because
ecological economics makes a good argument for bringing the resources of the biological system into the market. Otherwise, the market can't recognize them and will act independently of them.
Exactly. So I think these are some of the ingredients for what is coming. But the problem is that the discussions are so crazy, they're so outlandish, and yet they make so much sense that it's hard to have them. Like I have very few people that you have these discussions with, and some people also get incredibly allergic to them because they go against so much of their values that they're scary, they're terrifying.
Also, it's overwhelming. Like you don't know the outcome, and so you
Yeah.
don't want to be exhausted, in an apocalyptic possibility. What you were saying about birds made me think of a person I knew who said, for them, the proof of God was look at a swarm of birds. Right? We don't know how that works. Science can't explain that, and therefore I need God. And that's very close to my perspective. Right? My perspective is, look, you don't understand about complexity sciences. We actually do have a pretty good explanation of those birds, but that explanation involves something that goes beyond my linear capacity to predict.
Awareness.
And it calls me into a wonderment that can only be solved by some kind of integrative super possibility that I might as well call God.
Yeah, yeah, I feel you 100%, because that, and that speaks to the point of, when someone makes a statement like, look at the birds, those are God, you're decoding. I always say, like any sentence is like a frequency, but that frequency embedded in itself has many other frequencies. So the frequency that goes like this could have a longer frequency that sort of is a harmonic with it. And when someone like your friend says something like that, you can go to a deeper level, and you can go and find the truth. You can go and find that implied meaning that you can agree with. One of my values is, on the surface, everything is up for negotiation. Nothing is right just because you said so. But deep down below, in whatever anyone says, there is something on which we can resonate at any depth. Some people you need to dig a lot, but there is. And I think that this whole idea of AI and consciousness and transcendence is luckily the point where this issue of emergentism and idealism will have to be again discussed. Like you will. What we have right now is a bunch of people who go around saying emergentism is a fact, and it's as established as the theory of evolution. And they can say that because if we made a poll of 99.9% of scientists, and you ask them, is emergentism true and is evolutionary theory true? They would say yes, yes, 99.999. But if you asked, can you explain how evolution works? 99.9 would say yes. If you say the same for emergentism, 100% would say no, because we don't have that right now. And I think there's a difficulty with coming to terms with the fact that we don't really have a proof of it. It makes sense. It sounds more reasonable. And there are a lot of fears attached to this. I see one peculiarity of, again, America. You remember what I said at the beginning, that America has this shift between religion and science that is very traumatic. I do believe that in the integral community, there is a lot of people that have had deeply traumatic experiences with religion. So whenever they smell anything that sounds transcendent or something like that, they immediately go to all the worst aspects of it. And I understand that. But that should not blind us into making raising very complex questions about this matter. But I do think that another value that these people bring, this whole controversy that we're having now in the community, is that when it comes to, let's call it idealism or consciousness being fundamental, Ken Wilber has made a fundamental mistake in speaking as if we should take his word for it. We're speaking as if we should take the great tradition's word for it. That is bad, because that has made, I think, a lot of us, me included at some point, sloppy in just thinking that we can assert certain things to be true just relying on these authorities. And I do think that a case can be made that subjectively you can have objective information about these things. Many people disagree, but you can't expect others to believe you. The subjective experience, I believe, can provide objective experience about the nature of reality, but it cannot be transferred. So it's not a valid mode of collective knowledge making. And until we have an upper right answer to the issue, we must always put like a warning saying, what I'm about to say has not been proven by science. It's speculation. My subjective experience suggests that it's true. The great tradition suggests that it's true. But until we have a formula that explains it in mathematics, this is still not settled. If he had made this warning consistently in all his book, we wouldn't be having this rift right now in the community.
In a way, that's the same problem as under-emphasizing the lower right quadrant. Say, well, the mathematics isn't quite there, or the scientific method doesn't quite support this. Right? There's a zone in which you could say, yeah, I experienced this, and also we experienced this, and it fits with my observations of the world, but where's the explanation from a scientific or more than scientific point of view that really locks this down? I think you're right that, you know, Ken Wilber has done tremendous service to the integral philosophy, but the way he speaks sometimes creates a mood that runs up against the very things he's trying to say.
Yeah, and it has been abused because, I mean, you do, like, sometimes you have these posts that are anti-idealist, which are, I find, sometimes obnoxious in their attitude. But the answers to these posts are equally obnoxious because they are appeals to know the great being, and you one day will realize, and like, they have given energy to a lot of people who have come to the same conclusion, but through pre-rational means. So I think that the conversation should not be, is idealism true or emergentism true? The real question is, what is a way we come to truth together? What is a good methodology?
What is reality such that it could be described in either of those ways?
Exactly.
Like I've been a pretty strong supporter of the Integral 2.0 project because I think it is important to set a standard for the pre-trans fallacy in how we discuss things with each other. But setting that standard doesn't take anything off the table.
Absolutely.
Like you were saying about AI, right? And we go, well, AI would be an emergent new form of consciousness or emergent new phenomenon of some kind. But that would only work if there's something in code that's fundamental to reality, which becomes idealism pretty quickly.
Exactly. So I think you said it perfectly. The issue is not taking ideas out of the table. The issue is defining common rules as how do we discuss and create knowledge together. So I think that any movement that starts by saying that this idea is off the table is not integral to begin with. But if you say this movement requires that for things to be established as true, they need to have all correlates, quadrants, I'm down with that. But then you need to also bring it. Like I need to see it. When you tell me emergentism is right, I need to see the formula. I need to see if I don't see it, then let's keep having a conversation, and let's have a better and better and better conversation. And again, I think we need to give a space for people to express. I think also, like, we're so intellectual in this field that if we got to know a little bit more about each other, we would be able a little bit more to empathize with each other.
And that's part of what this project is, right? Like what Bruce and I are trying to do is to present people from the community back to the community so that we understand each other as more than just names on posts.
Or opinions.
Yeah. Now, I just want to check in because I don't mind continuing to talk. I'm having a really good time. It's been 2 hours. If you need to leave, that's great. But otherwise, I'm happy to talk a little bit longer.
I don't need to leave. So let's keep it going as long. You keep the time. So keep it going as long as you
All right. Well, let me ask you a question that touches in on something you said a little while ago about it being a human right to know yourself.
Okay.
Right now, in Canada, we've had a discussion for years that's never come to anything of the federal government saying the government was going to guarantee our personal ownership of our medical information. Right? And we would be given our medical information digitally, and we could transfer it to doctors, but we fundamentally own it and can transfer it. So that's a situation which there's state confirmation of individual autonomy over some information. Now, when you say self-knowledge is a human right, How do you feel about states guaranteeing your control of your individual information profile? Is that something that's necessary, or is that something we can do away with through new, more sophisticated computational systems?
Look, like in Italy, we have, in Europe actually, we have incredibly hardcore privacy laws. My God, that's like such a blessing, because most companies have to operate also in Europe. So it's easier to then adopt that standard sort of across the board. The penalty for a single privacy violation in Europe is up to like 1 or 2 million euros for one user. So that means that if you have 10 people or 100 people or 100,000 people that sue you, then that's a problem. The problem is that these laws are not enforced because people are not asking for things. So this to me brings me to another thing that I've been thinking a lot about. I wrote another paper on this, which is what I call the Internet of Communities. Now, the problem is there are many people that are dreaming this internet that we're talking about. It's called the D-Web, the decentralized web. The problem is that there hasn't been sufficient incentive yet to bring people from centralized platforms to non-centralized platform, or for people to demand ownership of their data in a way that the owners are obliged to. Now, let's say I create a community with 700,000 people, and on their behalf, I send a letter to Facebook and I say, you need to send us all our data. The beauty is that they have to. Right now, that issue of privacy law, at least in Europe, has already been passed. And it's become an incredible asset because they have to. They will send me some book like this of data, and it will take a while for us to make sense of it. But if 700,000 of us can re-own that data, we can build businesses with ourselves that leverage that data. So the point I'm getting to is that if you want social change, on one hand, you need strong laws, such as the privacy laws. They're good. And on the other hand, you need communities that move all at once data. If single individuals are not going to cut it. But if you have entire groups of individuals that make demands for their data and they're entitled to them, and you create financial incentives and technological systems to use this data, then you can help the shift. So if you want to re-own your data, the best way, I think that right now, I'm sure that in Canada, if you ask any medical supplier to give you your data, they're forced to do it. But probably they will give it to you in a really shitty way, in some really incomprehensible system and stuff like that. So what I would do is that I would create a coalition of patients. I would demand data from all these platforms. I would create a single ontology for the data, and I would say, this is our standard. Within 1 year, you need to adopt this. We're not going to work with this insurance or this other insurance. So leveraging collective power is what workers have done to gain rights. Unions. Unions are an essential element of democracy. And right now, we have this new breed, this new thing that is communities, such as the integral community. Imagine even the integral community. Say it's like, 4,000 people? Let's say we all want to read our own psychological psychograph because we want to use ourselves collectively as a sample to build a business based on AI using integral theory. We could get together and actually do that. Like, it would be fairly easy. We just agree with each other, we make a legal agreement, we ask their data, and we do it. So communities, and also the problem with communities, take someone like Corey, who's doing an amazing job to curate, and as many others, like Bruce and yourself. How much money are you guys making from this? Actually, let me rephrase it. How much money are you guys losing from this?
Yeah, we're making nothing. So we haven't even calculated what we're losing.
So the problem is that communities are the new, hold on, I believe. They're the new holon of the integral society, where my belongings, I will belong not just to Italy, but I will belong to these different communities. These different communities will have a different agency within the system in terms of decision making. Say I belong to 5 communities, then my vote counts, 1/5, 1/5, 1/5. And these communities need business models. They need new ways to survive. And data is actually how they can do that. You gave me a great segue to tell what my business is about, if you allow me to then.
Go ahead.
You can give me 2 minutes because only because it's relevant. What we've done after many pivots, what we've done is that we've built a database of about 240,000 communities around the world. And what we've done is that we've aggregated data from different platforms that they're on. So you have a single community that's on Meetup, on Twitter, on Facebook pages, and Facebook groups. And what we've done is that we've taken the data from the different platforms so that we can display this data to sponsors that want to work with these communities. Now, what do I expect? What I expect is that if we become successful, Facebook will say, you're not allowed to use this data. Or Twitter will say the same. So what I will do at that point is that I will give 10% of my company to the communities in my community, and I'll say, I'll give you a cut. But you fight with me to argue that this data is yours. So if before we were taking it via APIs or other ways, now we legally demanded that they have to send it to us. And they have to send it to us in a readable way and so on and so forth. So part of what I'm actually doing with my business is to create the business model for leveraging data at a community level so that it's easier to take it away. And unless I become evil in the process, my goal is to sort of divest control over this and leave this into the hands of communities. And it will become World Heritage, hopefully.
I think there's a lot of people in the community who would support something like that, insofar as they understood that it was happening.
Yeah.
Another thing that came up for me earlier in terms of having good conversations with people, whether at this level or the impossible conversations level, is the role that might be played by different lines of intelligence. So in the integral model, there's these different lines, but that's not too different than talking about the different chakras in a spiritual model, right? We have these different thematic aspects of ourselves. And so one of the things that comes up for me in having these kinds of conversations is, should I specifically make sure the conversation hits these different notes, right? Should I ask about the personal and the impersonal? Should I touch on food and sexuality and emotion and vision? And is there some important function of folding in all these different styles of intelligence into the discussion? So on the one hand, in terms of just getting a good conversation, but on the other hand, in terms of setting up a profile of an individual that actually encompasses the multidimensional reality of who they are.
Okay, so this is a great question because the thing that I've been pondering about lately is exactly this. It's exactly the issue of lines. I have a bit of lines bug me. Lines are the least tidy part of the integral map. They're just kind of there. It's this thing, there is infinite ones and there are 5 that are better. Come on, like to me, that's where like Ken got sloppy at the end. He was just like, yeah, it makes sense, we'll put it there, like I'll tidy it up later. So it feels like there was some degree of completion that is lacking. So I have not yet formalized it well. I wanted to write something about it, but my core belief is essentially the following, that lines and levels are deeply correlated with each other. So if you look at the main lines, while the main lines can be developed at all levels, each line tends to be the most signifying aspect of a certain level. So let's say moral development, that's blue. That's when it comes about that you do things not just for yourself. That's what that line essentially is about. It's a line about morality. Cognitive development, that's orange. That's obviously orange. Interpersonal development, that's obviously green. So my sense is that it works a little bit as a matrix. So you develop to a certain stage depending, so this is a little bit like how I represent it.
Okay.
So these are the lines, right? But we can call it like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Now, even though there are more lines within this, some of them you can break into it. So like kinesthetic and eating, they go into the first rung, right? So what happens is, take me, let's say that I have a problem in my second line of development, my sexual pleasure, you know, all that is typically related to that, psychosexual development and so on and so forth. So let's say that here, I'm stuck here. I haven't really done a lot of growth, and this is creating trouble in my life. But let's say that, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's say that at my cognitive development, I am a master. I've grown a lot. So my insight is, A, when talking to someone, yes, you should not just know what their level are at, or what are the lines that they have developed or not, because actually very often you have multiple of those at play. And then the other thing is that, let's say that my sexual development is not doing well. You don't go to this person and you just say, okay, go and have orgies. What you do is you tell them, okay, you're very developed cognitively, read a book about sexuality. So what you do is that you use, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you use the cognitive line, the cognitive level, that itself can touch different lines. It's a matrix, 7 by 7, and I start from here. And I work my way below and upwards. So in this way, any type of self-developmental technique can be applied to all levels, to propel all lines. So I'll make an example. Ken talks about integral meditation in many of his books. So that's definitely into the causal state, witnessing, and so on and so forth. But what he says is that I don't just witnessing. I witness my body. I witness my desire. I witness my will and willfulness. I witness my emotion. I witness and I embody it as different identities. So that's an example of using a 7th level activity to develop all lines. But what I can also do is that I can use my cognitive line of development to work on all these. And I can use my interpersonal capacities to work on all these, and my perspective taking all this. Even my kinesthetic level can be used on all this. Let's say I'm a cook, and I'm here. I can learn taste, just actually learning to differentiate taste, but I can also learn molecular cooking. So I think that lines are so I'm making 2 points. Lines are much more well interpreted as a matrix between stages we prefer, like main stages we've accrued, techniques that correspond to these different structures, and the lines that they develop. So it's a matrix. And one of my other projects is to map all potential meditative and self-development practices, and I believe that you can do it with this. And if you divide each of these square into a quadrant, you have all the possible things that you can do to participate in society, for example, or to learn about science and so on and so forth. So my first point is this: we can use this as a map, and it's more tidy. And the second, and it also cognitively makes sense. You have functions that compound to other functions of the brain. And the other point is, when you want to help people develop, use the lines that they have well developed to support the development of the other lines. So if you're a little bit stiff, but you're very smart, I will give you some logical concepts that can help you become a little bit less stiff and move around. If you're a very expressive person, I will not make you rationalize things. I will get you to express yourself at these different levels and so on and so forth. So I think that that's something we need to take into account. And I do think that, for example, most people often, they create chaos, not because of their level of development in terms of opinion, but because they didn't develop the line of self-control. Simple as that. But they didn't develop empathy enough, and so on and so forth. But you can, again, use these things.
Yeah, on the first part, I'm unsure. I'd have to think through it a lot more.
I need to
One of the
formalize
things
it a little
that
better.
would make
It's
a
a new
difference
thought.
there is whether there's approximately the same types of lines as there are stages of development, or whether it turns out there's many more lines of intelligence than there are stages of development.
My postulation is that there are infinite lines, but they can all be categorized within those seven.
Well, fair enough. So it would be then whether or not the categories of types of lines of intelligence exceed the number of stages or not. And that might be an area for future research. But in terms of playing off well-developed lines, it feels very solid to me. I like that one a lot, which is, like you were saying, about provide the person with a high cognition, the book about sexuality. I think that's a very streamlined and practical approach to bringing up development across multiple lines.
And my biggest goal in life, seriously, is to be able to create a map by which, once I've interviewed you and we've understood where you are on the cosmic address, I can clearly tell you what are the things that you can do to either deal with some challenges that you need or to self-develop yourself. Not only based on what you need, but based on what you would actually feel comfortable with doing on all quadrants. So that would mean, what can you do based on who you are, what type of practice or techniques you can do to self-develop, as well as what type of new perspectives you need to entertain, what type of new skills you need to know, and what type of engagement in the world would give you a sense of purpose and joy. And this, to me, speaks to the fact that spirituality is very removed from society. But I think that you cannot really be a happy person unless you have a sense of purpose. And saying that is, in a sense, is an integral statement. Like, your happiness cannot be removed from your participation in the different quadrants. Corey shared some time ago are you familiar with the concept of ikigai? Mm-hmm. Ikigai. So he shared an integral ikigai, which I thought, crap, that's brilliant. And you have what the world will be willing to pay you for, lower right, what the world needs, lower left, what you're passionate about, upper left, and what you're skilled at, upper right. And I think that the key quality of an integral society is the democratization of integral ikigai. Like, if you imagine a society where everybody can live at the cross-section of those four, to me, that's exactly an integral society.
So that's the
guiding value.
Overarching moral orientation of systems that we set up, is that they have to enable that to occur.
To me, exactly, absolutely. So for me, the key moral orientation of an integral society is democratizing ikigai. Absolutely. And also, it's an easy sell. It's an easy sell, because nobody subjectively would not want to have all four. And if you don't wish them for other ones, you're a dick. So you could argue that it's not possible, but that's another question.
There's an interesting element here that ties into the earlier part of our conversation, which is the integration of features. Right? Like, I've proposed a model of spirituality and religion that's based on the production of surplus quality in individuals or groups through the integration of their subsystems.
Mm-hmm. Yes, of course.
But that's interesting because it can apply at any of the stages.
Absolutely.
Right? So if a person is at the amber blue stage, and what they've got is a very obviously integrated world experience, and they call that the excess quality of that integration, they call God. Mm-hmm. And then they encounter a version of modern society, which has done a lot of good work in differentiating and complexifying the processes, but hasn't integrated modernity into like a super modern numinous spirit quality, then they might look at that and say, well, that one fails. It's not doing its job yet. So why would I not want to regress to the previous stage? Which in a way is what we see in terms of the rise of certain kinds of quasi-fascist or authoritarian movements in the world, is people saying, look, modernity and post-modernity aren't doing their job. I might as well go back to a quasi-medieval system that at least was bringing together all of its parts.
I 100% agree. And I think that we don't, I think that you made a better explanation of transcend and include. Because when people say transcend and include, they basically generally say, okay, we include what it's obviously okay, and we transcend what it's obviously crap. That's not how it works. The way it works is that you transcend, you alienate what is obviously crap. And 2 levels later, you're like, crap, there was something there, and I didn't get it. And by reopening it, it's like the software compounds each other, and it multiplies exponentially. So I gain that new computer that now multiplies with these other ones, and I have enough computing energy to get to the one above. And I think that I wholeheartedly agree. The development is about really regaining the worst of what we thought was lost, not by taking the worst, but really understanding what is it that we're not getting, what is it that got lost and needs to be reowned. And it also makes sense from a physical standpoint. Like, you can't just, like, it's an energetic structure, it's an information structure. I really think that we need to begin to talk about the thermodynamics of consciousness. Like, consciousness, when you look at the integral map, it seems like, I know that this is a very woo statement, but it seems to be operating at a large scale like a non-linear quantum system. So when you look at the rungs of integral map, that looks like a freaking atom. Like, that looks like something that every once in a while gets enough energy and jumps. And so I do think that we can make incredible analogies in terms of the operating structure of this. I do think that obviously regaining alienated, and in this sense, energy and information in physics are translatable. So when you say a point of view has been lost and we regain it, we regain energy and we make the system jump.
So when you think about the electron jumping to the next quantum orbital level, what's the analogy to that? Like, what is, for an individual, what is the energy that they would need in order to make that jump?
So energy is different things. So if we had to sort of compute the process of jumping to a new level, you have different things. So for example, first of all, you have energy dissipation. So you have energy that you're wasting. In meditation, you learn to control your mind. That's a process of not having an energetically wasteful process that doesn't make sense. So that in itself is a process of adding energy. Now, taking multiple perspectives, again, is another form of adding information. Here, energy information, same thing. Regaining awareness of your physical body structure, a lot, like you physically can tell that if you feel your body, you feel more energetic.
So you're folding in and integrating more types of experiences, and this causes the buildup of the energy that becomes the jump.
Correct. At some point, it seems like it reaches a point of jump, essentially. And to me, the most interesting part is that Ken Wilber has created the best map that we have of how consciousness at the macro level seems to operate. So you have, they have the theory of relativity on one side that is only concerned with large objects. And you have the quantum theory that is only concerned with small objects. To a sense, integral theory very well describes a lot of what's in the middle. So to me, there are not 2 theories to integrate to come up to a fundamental theory of the universe. There are 3. One of these theories is integral theory. And I've been tirelessly trying to persuade physicists that, guys, like, if you look at this thing, these incredibly elegant objects, I'm sure there is mathematics that you could find that if you reverse engineer it, could give you additional information about how to integrate these other tools. I don't think that's a crazy argument to make. Yet everybody, they politely dismissed me in this attempt. But I think that
it's easy for them to throw that out, because it sounds like when you're talking about that middle ground between the macro and the micro,
it sounds like
you're talking about social and psychological phenomenon that are fundamentally different than physics. So they don't want to get involved. But I think you're right that there is potentially a physical or informational description of that middle ground that could bring them together.
I mean, if you look at so there is this theory that, at a given time in a society, you have different people at different levels. There is a certain amount of people at this level, a certain amount of people at this level, and so on and so forth. And these may have a different relative amount of power within their society. Now, so that is in a sense a probability wave. Now the next level tends to, let me see if I have another pen, tends to look something like this. I mean, if that doesn't look similar to the mode of operation of quantum, so I'm not saying that there's a quantum dynamics at play, but I'm not saying that. I'm saying that there is a mathematical, that it seems to work at large scale, that needs to be looked at, and it needs to be integrated with our common science. So I haven't tried with Penrose, because if he told me no, I would just become depressed. But I like, to me, he's the guy who's closest right now to figuring some of these things out. And I think, again, integral theory does offer something interesting there. And let me put it in a different way. Yeah. Any foundational theory of physics must be able to generate what we see happening with integral theory. It has to produce that.
Yeah, exactly. Otherwise, it doesn't describe the universe that we inhabit. The quantum thing is fascinating to me because of the way that it requires multiple pathways simultaneously, whether we think of those pathways as potentials or probabilities or as real simultaneous universe outcomes. There's a sense in which that's the green expansion of modern physics, is to say, yes, physics exists, but it's not just moving along this channel, it's moving along a whole bunch of different channels you didn't take into account. And then the integral move is to figure out how those multiple channels actually converge or provide a common, integrated, universal experience of reality.
And I mean, if there is quantum mechanics at play in the brain, as Penrose with his orchestrated objective reduction model suggests, then it's not insane to claim that the developmental process may touch on some of these similar structures, in a sense. So I mean, this is as far as I can go. Otherwise, I would be completely out of depth. But what I'm just saying is that these are things that sound insane, but if you start with some premises, say consciousness could be fundamental because so and so, then you actually need to acknowledge all these other possibilities. And I think not doing so is even boring. It's just fun to do.
Yeah. The notion that there are something like stages in terms of how we think about our psyche is fundamental to a lot of this stuff, because the Integral 2.0 people who are concerned about idealistic misrepresentation, I think a lot of what they're doing is saying that modern rational linear progress and algorithmic computation is the minimum standard we should apply in all the quadrants. It's not just about how we analyze atoms. It's also about how we think about our own experience. And our experience isn't just what we feel it is. It's something that we also have to have an analytic inspection of. Just in the same sense that modern science tells us that physical reality isn't just how it appears to our sensory organs, that same level of processing should tell us that about our subjective experiences. So what we think we experienced isn't necessarily what we experienced. We have to apply some kind of advanced verification model. But the step beyond that is this really complicated pluralistic expansion, right? Which is ecology, which is quantum, which is multiple perspectives, which in the individual is maybe there are multiple meanings and multiple outcomes and multiple pathways within my own experience of myself at any moment. And then beyond that is some kind of computational infrastructure that could make sense of all those pathways in ourselves and in the physical universe and in our computational systems and in our experience of each other.
See, I mean, I do believe that ultimately there is for sure some, and I'm also surprised that they never make computational arguments. Like that to me, it's also a bit surprising. But have you probably seen the work of Steve Wolfram?
Yes.
It's amazing. It's insane. Like this idea that you can just simulate incredibly simple processes, like the patterns by which something becomes white or black. I'm saying it for the benefit of anybody who's listening. And that by coding the different patterns by which this happens, we see incredibly complex fractal structures emerge. So I absolutely think that that's 99.99999% of the picture. I do believe that there is some math at the beginning of the world that you code it and you get skateboards, computers, and hamburgers, like just inevitably, that produces the entire complexity of reality. But the problem is that seems like we have very reasonable reasons to think why that may not be enough, namely the fact that we haven't been able to simulate consciousness, and namely the fact that we have theorems in mathematics that show that computation alone cannot explain anything fundamentally. That's Gödel's theorem or the Turing machine. So the fact that we're not looking at this is scary because it's not scary intellectually. It's just scary that you may have a lot of highly intelligent people that may be overlooking this problem out of ideology and not out of actually having looked through it. Penrose complains that most of the complaints that he gets don't really quite get to the core of his interpretation. And that seems to suggest that there isn't really a dialogue really happening there. So
yeah, you could make a Ken Wilber type rebuttal to Gödel, saying that what he's describing is not a fundamental limit on reality, but a fundamental limit on quadrants, right? Which is that no system in one of the dimensions of reality can account for reality in general.
I never thought of that, but that's I mean, I do agree. But then fundamentally, when you sort of reverse engineer the whole integral map to a single point, that single point alone is not enough by Gödel's theorem. So there needs to be...
Every quadrant would have to be able to describe that fact, right? Yeah. So if Gödel was looking at it in the lower right, just in terms of mathematical and logical systems, if he looked intently enough, he would find a point in there that says that this zone can't justify itself on its own.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of misconceptions also arise, again, because we have these sort of very fantastic interpretations of what consciousness all the way down looks like, which is like, I mean, obviously, if you anthropomorphize the idea that the telephone feels like it's a telephone, that's obviously insane. Moreover, it doesn't have a brain, so how would it parse reality? But the best argument, I think, making a case for, say, consciousness all the way down, so basically saying anything that has a quantum nature may be tapping into something that is akin to subjectiveness, to pure subjectiveness, nothing else. We need to consider that relativity shows us that anything at a quantum level moves at such a speed that it's so close to the speed of light, if that thing had a subjectivity, its own subjectivity would be that of a universe that starts and ends in a single instant. So not only that kind of solves the problem, because you no longer need to assume something that looks irrational, but it is also consistent with the idea that this very consciousness that is down below is fundamental, is timeless, and has absolute qualities. So to me, and this is a purely speculation from having drunk too much wine, is that the capacity of the brain is that of allowing this fundamental subjectivity to experience reality at our own perception of the speed of light. So basically, if you're looking at someone who's falling into a black hole, you see them stuck. You don't see them moving. But from their point of view, zip, everything disappears in an instant because he's falling down at increasingly closer to the speed of light. I think that our experience of the world is pretty much the same. So the outside physical world is stuck as if it was on an event horizon. It's going incredibly slowly. From its own point of view, it's ended already. From its own point of view, there isn't this thing. So consciousness is somehow the product of physical matter building a brain that is able to tie this fundamental subjectivity to something that has memory, essentially. It has past, present, and future, and that participates into this entire process, always following the laws of cause and effect. I don't believe in free will, in the sense that I think there are increasingly higher degrees of free will, but ultimately it's all due to that initial coding. So if you take this initial coding plus a fundamental awareness, then the universe goes on its own. But to me, it doesn't seem like an absolutely dogmatic or fundamentalistic claim. And I think that, I would never say it's true, but I would also want to see from Ken like a greater effort to tie this all together with physics and upper, because it would just get so much more credence.
Yeah, and Ken's an old guy. It may not be his job to do that. It may be our job to do that at this point.
Maybe.
I tend to think in terms of freer will rather than free will.
I agree.
And that's very interesting in terms of what you were saying about Wolfram stuff, because if Wolfram is correct, then there's limits on how well one complex process can compress another complex process, right? So there's always going to be, you don't have to have free will for your own actions to be infinitely unpredictable to every other system, right? So you could say, I have free will in the sense that no one else can predict exactly what I'm going to do next. But nonetheless, that may be the purely deterministic outcome of a computational process.
Exactly. So I think that that part of the reason why people don't like arguments against free will is because other than the fact that it's counterintuitive, because you notice yourself doing things, but with a little bit of meditative practice, you do notice that things happen to you. It's like thoughts happen to you, action happen to you, desires happen to you. The main point is that we do get increasingly greater levels of freedom with growth. So the more I understand the systems of causation within my own mind, the more I emancipate myself from them, and the more I can act rationally and effectively.
The more I know how I'm determined, the more freer my will is.
Exactly. But that does not mean that
I
I escape.
Upset about arguments against free will. I think it's because it reminds them of the moral obligation to attempt to make their will more free.
I never thought about that. But it is true. It is true, because to me, paradoxically, the beauty of understanding that we don't have any free will is that it reveals the potential for the infinite degrees of freedom by which we can develop by understanding the mechanics of cause and effect. So you're only going to get freer by accepting that you don't have free will.
Yeah.
And I think that it morally, as a society, accepting that there isn't a fundamental free will is another one of those key moral structure of an integral society, because it's a simple rule. If you apply this concept wherever you go, and you say, you remind yourself. So when I have an argument with my wife, we always be like, okay, causality. Like because we stop and we realize that happened. There was a process we were a part of. We need to dissect it and act on it. So that actually in our relationship has become a key moral system of interpretation that helps us decode and work with each other. And it also gives us a bit of patience when looking at the world, because you're frustrated, but ultimately, it's causality. And that gives you a sense of peace and a sense of compassion. And it's a simple concept. Like it's a simple concept that once you learn it, you can apply it to literally everything. So it's like a hyper concept.
There's a great book called Spacious Body, I think by Jeffrey Maitland, who was he's the head of the World Rolfing Institute.
Okay.
They work with the fascia layer above the body in therapy, but he was a student of Adi Da, and he was a Zen student for a while. And in that book, he defines freedom as the creative appropriation of limitation. He keeps coming back to that in the book, right? If you can take possession of your limits, then you are free in that degree.
See, and it's
but
like,
as far as you can accept determination, then you have freer will.
See. It's like, if you want to change society, you need to realize that society is made by men. So you need to take responsibility for the structure of causality so you can re-engineer it. So what most people find a really hopeless idea, to me, accepting causality it's the most freeing idea in the world, because it gives me a sense that I can work on anything, because if anything has a cause, anything can be tweaked with, anything can be fixed. Gramsci, this famous communist author, had this motto, which is the motto of my father, which is the pessimism of reason and the optimism of will. Meaning, you accept the full complexity and shittiness of the world, but that very process can be tied to wanting to make it better. And you can, because it's a rational world, ultimately.
It reminds me of Nietzsche. To say of every it was that I willed it thus, right? Which is to accept the way things are as the precondition for being able to will them to be the way you would like them to be.
Or another one is everything as it is, and it could not have been otherwise, from Max Weber. He's a sociologist.
I love this conversation. You and I should talk again.
Absolutely.
I think we have to come to the end, and Bruce can edit this however he likes. I just saw out the window, my family has re-arrived, so they're going to make a bunch of noise in a minute. This has been fabulous, Damiano.
It was also fantastic for me. I long to have people with whom I can have these conversations. So even if this wasn't recorded, it would have made my week, I would say, not even my day. So
well, let's set up a chance for us to talk. I like this a lot.
Fantastic. Fantastic. I look forward. Say hi to Bruce.
I will.